Welcome to Lectionary Call-In for Tuesday, September 22nd, where two laypersons, a pastor and an academician, gather for about 55 minutes each week to discuss the Gospel Lectionary for the coming Sunday. And this Sunday is September 27th. Each Tuesday we call in from wherever we may be at 6:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And for our friend Charles Willard in Minnesota, that's 5:30 a.m. Our little team is working to be faithful to Lectionary Year A, and we hope this discussion will provide areas of focus and reflection. We work independently in advance of the call-in with some preliminary information on what the leadoff person would like to discuss, and then we develop perspectives, share, encourage, and challenge each other. And here are the folks joining us in today's discussion.
Bill Hall.
Sarah Mickelson.
Charles Willard.
And I'm Don Upton. And Bill Hull is our leadoff today. He'll be guiding us through the questions and discussion. Hello, Bill. What's going on?
Good morning. Welcome, team members, and those joining us later. We're glad that all of you are part of this conversation. In just a moment, I will read the scripture today. But let me briefly remind us of what happened since last week in Scripture. Last week we looked at Matthew 20, the workers in the vineyard, the issue of people hired at different times of the day and the seeming unfairness and the dialogue that went on with that. Following that, Jesus again predicts his suffering and death. The mother of James and John asked Jesus to give her sons a special place in his kingdom. Jesus heals two blind men. Then he enters Jerusalem and engages in what we refer to as the cleansing of the temple. Then he curses the fig tree because it was barren. And then we come to today's scripture where we will see and hear about a challenge to Jesus' authority, and then he tells a story about two different kinds of sons. And for today, I'm going to read the passage from Frederick Dale Bruner's commentary and his translation, not because there's some significant issue of translation, but he frames it in a way that I find a little more contemporary for us. So, the word of the Lord from Matthew 21. When Jesus entered the temple, the senior pastors and the lay leaders came up to him while he was teaching and said, "By what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority?" And Jesus responded and said to them, "I'm going to ask you just one question myself, and if you answer me, I will tell you by what authority I am doing these things." Here is the question. The baptism of John, where did it come from? From heaven or from humans? Well, they had quite a discussion among themselves, saying, if we say from heaven, Jesus would be sure to ask us, then why did you not believe him? But if we say from humans, we will have to fear the crowd since they all consider John a prophet. So they answered Jesus by saying, we do not know. And Jesus said to them, neither am I going to tell you by what authority I am doing these things. Jesus continued, what is your opinion? A man had two sons. He went up to the first one and said, my child, go out and work in the vineyard. And his answer was, I don't want to. But later on he changed his mind and went. The father came up to the other son and said the same thing. And this son's answer was, yes, sir, right away. But he did not go. Which of the two do you think did the will of the Father? They said, the first. Jesus said to them, amen, I tell you, the extortionists, tax collectors, and the whores are going into the kingdom of God ahead of you. You see, John came to you with the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him. But the tax collectors and whores believed him, but you, even when you saw all this happening, you did not change your minds later on and believe him. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God.
And now, as is our custom, I'll turn to Charles for his opening observations. Charles?
This is going to be a little strange because what I want to do is report that this particular text contains one of the most complex textual problems that I have seen in the New Testament. And I'll describe the differences, but just to say that we're not going to deal with these differences. I simply want the hearers to be aware that underneath what seems to be a straightforward statement is, in fact, in the textual tradition, a very complex tradition. We've heard that in the text that was read, the first son says no, and he went, and the second son says yes, and he goes, but he did not go, and the one who was determined by the Pharisees that it was the one who did the Father's will was the first one, the one who said, I don't think so, but then changed his mind. There are substantial, in terms of numbers, there are substantial witnesses for three different readings of this text. One has the first son saying no, and he goes, and the second son says yes and doesn't go, and he's defined as the one who does the Father's will. One has the first one saying no, and he goes, and then the second son says yes, and he goes not, and it's the first one who is said who does the Father's will, and the last one, the first son says yes, and he doesn't go, and the second one says no, and he goes. So, as I said, it's a complex discussion, and I decided to do some reading. I did, and I read two very complicated, detailed discussions of these textual differences, and they came to completely different conclusions. So I'm going to leave it the way it was read, in which the first son says no, and he went, and he was the one who was determined by the Pharisees to have been doing the Father's will. So that's where we are. But I want you to know that it is unusual ground that we're standing on in using this particular choice of readings, that among the thousands of New Testament documents, manuscripts we have, they are spread over.
Okay. Thank you, Charles. Thank you. Now, I have three questions. And I think I will just simply start with the first one. Sometimes we read all three, but I will read the first one. And, Sarah, I'll give you a heads up. I'm going to go to you first.
Thank you.
Acknowledging that we cannot know fully the mind of Christ or of the writer of Matthew's gospel, that's just a fact. We're not into mind reading, but we read this. What might be the reason, or what are the reasons that we guess that Jesus told the story of the two sons immediately following Jesus' interchange with the chief priests and elders about the source of Jesus' authority? As Matthew frames this, Jesus immediately after that interchange tells the story. Sarah, what guesses do you have to share with us?
I'm going to go with mutterings and ponderings, or cogitation, as my mother would describe it. It seems to me that the witness of John does not impress or impact the listeners in the temple. I wonder if that has something to do with seeing and hearing what John said as God-authorized truth. So it made me think about, and I have to give credit to the Followers of the Way podcast that's recorded a day ahead of ours. One of the questions they asked was, what holds authority in your life, in our lives? And with authority, I think, comes priority. So I wonder about those who studied and knew Scripture and were temple dwellers, yet did not recognize the truth and authority from which John spoke. I wonder about their recognition of God's authority in their own lives. And did this displacement of authority give root to an unwillingness to surrender personal power, perhaps even more so, gave them a blindness to see the hand of God at work in their own lives and in their world? It seems that they did not yield to God's authority personally, so they failed to recognize God's authority in John's teaching and preaching. And because of their self-selected power preservational blindness, the good news that John brought failed to impact them and inform them and inform the changing of their behavior forever. Their desire to be first, to hold their place in line and their position, relegated them to the end of the line. So I think that the connection between their recognition of authority or their inquiry about authority had more to do with a questioning of whether or not they have to respect the word that John brought and the word that Jesus brings. And if it doesn't pass their litmus test, then they perceive it to be a foreign object to which they don't have to subscribe, leaving them or relegating them to a faith that's observational and not transactional or actional. So that's my 2 cents worth.
Good. Thank you. Powerfully said. Dawn?
I did write it down.
Dawn?
How about a meditation on words, reputation, opinion making, power? It does flow nicely into the story of the 2 sons, and I think if it's meant to be connected so clearly, then we would say that the first part, when they're talking about authority, there's this agreement. I'm going to push it a little bit. Say, as you know, we have the power to create meaning, identity. We have the ability to place John where he's appropriate. We can interpret his ministry as we see fit. It's our job. And so we have the power to create John's identity. We have the power to weigh authority. In a way, we have the power to be God. And I'm not pointing my finger at those that were behaving that way. I'm pointing it at myself. I'm pointing it at life every day. And the reason I think it flows into the story so well is if you take, and to your point, Charles, I won't say son 1, son 2, because it'll get mixed up. I'll go yes, son, and no, son. No being the one that turned around, and yes being the one that didn't. And if you focus on yes, son, and the ability of these people to create identity, which I believe they do. I think that's what the fallen world's all about, why it's so chaotic. We can shape people's opinions and lives every day if we choose to, instead of being responsible to our families and our community. Yes, son says, I will. And I think it raises with everybody that reads it, does he create meaning by saying that? Does he create value? Now, immediately you probably go, well, it's hypocrisy. There's no meaning. It's not good. It's evasive. But I think the answer has to be he did. That by saying yes, for some people, at a certain point in time, he said yes. And that's all we remember. While son number 2 turns around and his entire day has changed and he takes action. We live in a world where saying yes and doing nothing actually matters. Just like the Pharisees and the conversations Jesus has, they live in a world where saying, let us weigh what authority he has. Let us weigh the meaning of his name. We must do that. That's our job, isn't it? And so for those reasons, I think they flow nicely together, Bill.
Thank you, Don. I've acknowledged in framing my question that we cannot get inside the mind of Christ, but I've invited us to make some guesses. My sense is that Jesus knew exactly what he was doing. A frontal challenge to the temple authorities' authority. We remember he had cleansed the temple, said it's to be a house of prayer, but you've made it a den of robbers. And then there in the temple, after chasing those money changers and sellers out, Jesus healed the blind and lame, and we're told the religious leaders became angry. And part of my reason for using Dale Bruner's translation, Don, is it makes it contemporary. Remember, it said the senior pastors and the lay leaders, making it contemporary. In today's language, Jesus' behavior was saying to the temple leaders, you have totally misunderstood the temple's mission statement. You think the temple is a place of economic commerce and profit. No, no, no. This is where prayer and healing is to be the focus, not economic gain. I think Jesus understood the depth of the challenge that he was offering to the powers that be. Later in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus says to the crowds and his disciples, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, so you must, and this is interesting, you must be careful to do everything they tell you, but do not do what they do. Can you imagine a more powerful indictment? If someone, when I was a pastor, and a new person come to visit and said, what's this church like? And the person says to them, now, when Reverend Hall preaches, you need to do what he advocates, but you'll observe his behavior and don't you ever dare do what he in fact does. I can't imagine a more incisive and disturbing indictment. Now, and he says, everything they do is done for people to see. In other words, they're making a show. They want to be greeted in the marketplaces and so forth. And so for me, and this is sort of getting into the following questions, Jesus is saying this isn't about vying for power and position. Instead, the issue is obedience to the call of God, particularly the command to serve others. And in Matthew 25, we remember that powerful parable. When did we see you hungry? Whenever you served people, whenever you did something to serve people, and you missed it when you did not do. So it's about actions. It's about what someone actually did. And then Jesus asked the religious leaders, who did the will of the Father? And Charles has elucidated challenges with the original text. But who did the will? And they acknowledged that the one who actually did the Father's bidding was the one who did the will of God. And then, as if he had not upset them enough, he says, the tax collectors and prostitutes will be ahead of you. They understood and you did not. All right. Question 2. Share your understanding of the parable's message and indicate how this story informs and challenges your faith life today and how this story might shape the church's ministry in our time. How's that for an assignment? Don, I'll start with you. You're up to the challenge, Don.
How about this? That there is a huge gap between affirmations and action. I'm just trying to make it simple for my life. And that we could look at the affirmation of son, yes, and then doing nothing. We can discuss whether that has value or not, but I think it's important to say that it does have value. That saying a yes and letting it hang in time with no action in our world has meaning, can influence people, can shape character. And then action can be something entirely different over time. I want to add time to it as well, that the ability to reflect and consider life, mission, and the gospel. Jesus has this. I don't know how long it takes for the son to go no, then yes, but there is time to consider. The prodigal is floating out there beyond sight, but we spend time with him as he does what he does and reflects on what home looks like and turns around. So I would add time to that. It's this week, and I'm, for those of you watching, by background, I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina today, and every meal and every meeting I've had with colleagues this week, check this out, has begun with something like, I'm going into a room tomorrow, or I was in a room with people today, and I had a hard time sizing up the audience. I had a hard time. There were new people there, and I had to self-censor myself, or I had to watch my language, or I had to say things differently because they would reach to conclusions, or they would view me as X. And it doesn't matter where you are on the philosophical or political scale. I think you know what I'm talking about. And so you have to sanction yourself. And I was talking about that, and I said, well, that made me sad. And all my friends were going, yeah, it's like I have to be careful. So this, I'm just raising that if it's familiar to you, especially these very difficult times, where this should be, I think, familiar to everybody. The ability to create power, opinion, ideas that suits us at a particular time, which means saying yes and meaning no could have value. So I just want to, the solution, I think, is not just in the parable with the son saying yes and no. I think there's a reminder that it's son. This isn't, there were some people in the market. It's not like last week where there's a landowner going out to find people who are strangers. This is the father. And I kind of need to draw a red line under that here. That part of the meaning of saying no and then reflecting is this is family. And when family's involved, and when you think about family and community, saying yes and letting it hang doesn't work any longer. And that over time there are things that need to take place. The son that says no and then says yes, his day is transformed. He goes from teeing up a no, a selfish no probably, into taking action, which I think here has to be a radically different response. As simple as it is, I'm in the vineyard today when I wasn't going to be, I think that has to be a really big deal. But it's not some stranger. This is family. This is life within a family, which makes the hypocrisy of son saying yes and doing nothing more stunning. So that's, and I think that's what applies to the church and what we're doing today, Bill.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Don. Sarah.
So, Don, I loved your conversation about constructing meaning and if you will, constructing our own Eden in contrast with the Eden created by God. So I'm going to use the word temple in place of the word Eden, and then it seems to me that humanity continually, and this may be the sin of wanting to have the mind of God, eating of the tree in the garden of the knowledge of good and evil, humanity wants to construct its own temple, wants to seek to create meaning instead of relying on God for that meaning. And using the temple as, if you will, the gateway or the citizenship test on whether or not it's acceptable practice in that particular ecosystem, the human ecosystem. So they're using the temple to adjudicate others as to whether or not their definition of Eden is acceptable. And Jesus walks in the middle of that and goes, my temple is not meant for this. And you know, trying to, if I had to draw a picture for you or describe it how I see it, they're using the hospital to paint a picture of what sterile looks like instead of using the hospital to care for people who are sick. So there's that sense of inappropriate usage so profound that it impacts the people who come for healing. They're driven away because there's no room. You're dirty, and you'll make my church less sterile or my temple less sterile. So I'm looking at that, and I'm hearing such language for my own self that invites me to walk with caution, to walk with humility and deep discernment to determine, am I guilty of this? Am I guilty of going, you don't believe what I believe, so you can't come in to the construct I have? Whether it's the relationship, the interaction that I'm gatekeeping, or if it's the practice of worship that I'm gatekeeping, or if it's simply the house that I live in that I'm gatekeeping. It's whether or not I invite you in has to do with whether or not I feel safe with you. And I think about that and I go, but that's not how I'm called. I'm called to live with vulnerability. I'm called to invite that which I don't understand in to better understand it and not to adjudicate it. So with safety measures in place, I'm thinking about that this week. It's a willing suspension of judgment from a perspective of, does it meet my criteria? It's not a willing suspension of judgment on whether or not it's safe. It's a willing suspension of whether or not I pass judgment and find it flawed. And so I hear that in this message as well, that maybe I'm not called to be the gatekeeper of my own temple or a gatekeeper of my church. Maybe I'm called to be a nurse that runs to triage instead.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm the son of a registered nurse mother, and your analogy of the hospital really captured my attention, Sarah. And I think of my mother as one. I think I was hand washing before I was born. If you're born to a registered nurse mother, she drills that into you. So mother paid attention to that, and the hospital was concerned. But ultimately, she saw the hospital as a place of healing. So, of course, it's both and. I'm sure you would agree. But you're talking about how in our faith life we can make keeping the place morally clean is more important than as Jesus did, healing those. Anyway, you set my mind to spinning with that one. Also, speaking of my childhood, I early on was always attracted to, while people didn't call them this, the proverbs or the short sayings. And I remembered some, your actions speak so loudly that I cannot hear a word you are saying. Another one was, talk is cheap. Talk is cheap. And more recently, Stephen Covey wrote the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And one of his proverbs is, I cannot talk my way out of a problem I behave my way into. And if you've read the book, it's a very graphic real-life experience that prompts that observation. In other words, if I behaved my way into an issue, I got to change my behavior. I can't just talk my way out of it. Now, talking about how it impacts your faith life and how it might shape the church's ministry in our time, the more I read this, some weeks ago, I went to work and made myself a document with every parable in the Gospels and differentiating which are only in Matthew and Mark and so forth. And I keep rereading those parables. There are a number in Matthew 22 or so, whatever. When I read them, I think among all of them, this one is brief, and I think even if we might use different language, we'd all say the point is the same. It's almost like there are no weeds to get into with this one. It's very clear, and even the religious leaders get it. They get the point of the story. And so for me, the story is an invitation, maybe even a command, to look within myself, to remember and honestly to acknowledge how and when I have in fact acted and when I have not done what I promised and committed myself to be and to do. This, to me, is a powerful invitation to self-reflection. And it's tempting to stay focused on the Pharisees and say they didn't get it. If I do that, I'm doing the very thing Jesus is challenging the Pharisees for doing. So at least for me, Jesus is saying, Bill, it's fine to be clear that these other religious leaders missed it. How are you missing it? And I think we are. I think there are ways in which we do miss it. Okay, the third question, background. When I was in seminary taking homiletics classes on preaching, one of the questions that we were asked to consider when we were preparing a sermon was, what's the good news in this passage? What's the gospel in this passage? So my question is, what gospel or good news do you hear in this parable? And I'll begin, and then I'll go to you, Sarah, and then to you, Don. The good news is, I am not a puppet, and God is not a puppeteer. The Father, if God's a puppeteer, the Father would simply have pulled strings, and his two marionette sons would have gone and done what he commanded. They had a choice. In my ministry, I was introduced to the insights of the 12-step recovery movement, and as one who personally never was chemically addicted, I worked with hundreds of people who were battling addictions, and one of the movements is Al-Anon, which is for the family of addicts, a family member or a friend. And Al-Anon seeks to help people be in relationship with an addicted person, but not enmeshed. And you may know this, the famous 3 C's of Al-Anon, talking about someone else's behavior, okay, not mine. I did not cause it. I cannot control it. I cannot cure it. Okay? So for me, there's both what's my responsibility, what choices am I making, how am I not living up to whatever it is I've committed myself to live up to. Conversely, I am not responsible for your choices. And I in preaching and in counseling and in relationships, it's a temptation or a trap to say, if you're missing the boat, how can I get you to do the right thing? And there's a place for influence. And we're sharing these insights, hopefully, so people will listen and gain something from it. But ultimately, the 3 C's are correct. I cannot control another person's behavior. And to me, the father in this story did not control his son's behaviors. He gave the instruction and left it there. And, you know, John the Baptist, it seems to me, focused on behavior. Repentance is primarily a behavior. And another modern proverb, the original version is not to decide is to have decided already. The shorter version is not to decide is to decide. If I tell myself, well, I'm not going to do something about that right now, that's a choice. That's a decision. And I think I've shared before, growing up in a church where this one elder, every time he prayed, he had the phrase, God, forgive me my sins of commission and omission. We can sin both ways. So again, it's the good news is I get to make decisions. And even if I've made a bad decision, upon further reflection, I can change that decision. And that, to me, is good news. Sarah?
I'm with you, Bill. I think the good news in this parable is it's all about family. It's never too late to respond to the gospel. No one is beyond the reach of God. Both sons are children of the vineyard owner. Both get into the kingdom of heaven, with one footnote that one experiences it sooner than the other. And that makes me wonder, what's the kingdom of heaven like for those people that choose to turn and go back to work in the vineyard? And that must be full of joy in such a way that I miss something if I choose not to go back to work in the vineyard. This makes me think about my relationship to God's authority, my participation in bringing the kingdom of heaven here and now, and how I'm living into the promise of grace. How do I see others moving toward God's grace and authority if I can't see myself doing that? I can't see what's going on internally in someone else's life. I only stand in judgment over the external that I can observe. And there's a bit of a rub for me. I need to let go of that. I said, what is the intention of my heart, and is it apparent to those that look at me? And is it apparent in my follow-through? I think that's the good news. Live in such a way that words are not necessary.
Who was it said, always share the gospel, if necessary, use words? Anything else, Sarah, before we move to Don? Thank you again. Don.
I'll just build on that. It's you could say yes, or you can get to work. And maybe we read this as an affirmation no matter what. You're always saying yes to something. Always saying yes. We have one person that says yes out of selfishness or really trying to impress somebody. And it may not matter. Nobody's going to see him working or not. Maybe it doesn't matter. The yes actually has value. It's an affirmation that he's got a certain kind of value. So you could say yes all day long. It's just a matter of, are you saying yes, or are you going to get to work? And so Sarah, I like the action part of this. I think it's important. And I've been thinking about, well, how do I apply it? I believe the gospel flows through every day, whatever we do, not just behind a church wall. The one thing I might keep in mind as I go through this day, where I have lots of meetings and I'm going to meet new people, is I think there's always a temptation, Bill, these days to create some kind of division of the room. You know, let's cut to the chase and see what all of you say yes to. No, do you say yes to the right things or the wrong things? It's all yes. It's all affirmation. So, you know, and I see it even over a small coffee meeting with people. It's like, you know, before we get started, what do you think about this? Which usually means, what are you affirming in your life, so that I can cut to the chase of who you really are. And as hard as it is, I think this is a call, I think, Sarah, you were going there, to talk about the work. And instead of saying the temptation, which is, where do you stand on this today? What are you saying yes to? Are you my brother or my sister or not? Then maybe it begins with, let's talk about what we're doing now and what we're doing tomorrow and what we were doing yesterday. And it does change the room. We know that. We know that from churches that talk about doing things. We try to do that where the four of us worship, doing or not. But I'm starting to see it all as an affirmation, not as a denial. And today I'm going to go out and affirm all kinds of things that create chaos, and I'm going to worry about what people think about me, and I'm going to affirm things. I'd even, Bill, say yes to things I don't really do. I've got a good one that's a part of the American journey today. Do you say yes to justice, or do you seek justice? Both are affirmations. What does the Father of the vineyard require of you? Seek justice. Not say yes to justice. Say yes to justice doesn't mean anything at all unless you want to have a reputation of saying yes to justice. It's all yes. But the doing is in the seek justice. So that's where I think the gospel is, Bill.
Thank you. By the way, just briefly, and then we'll move on back to Charles. By the way, Charles, there's a new image of you there for a moment. I enjoyed it. There's a retired seminary professor in our retirement community, and he taught Hebrew. And, you know, at Palmacia, we sing that song for the children, Seek Justice. Actually, according to my friend, the Hebrew clearly says, do justice. Now, there's a little bit of a hair splitting there, but I find that powerful. Do justice. Not think about it, seek it. Now, how to do it is very difficult, I would agree. Okay, back to you, Don, and you can go to Charles.
Great, great. Well, I know Charles has been listening carefully, and I'm really interested in your thoughts on the conversation so far.
Well, my mind went in several different directions. The first is I was reminded actually yesterday during my listening to the discussion of the same parable and the same interaction by the followers of the way, and they were talking about Jesus' interactions with the leaders of the temple and how it sort of regularly was in bad shape. But in fact, at the very beginning of Jesus' adult life, it was different. And I want to read a passage from Luke chapter 2, beginning with verse 46. You will recognize this when you hear it. After 3 days, his parents found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions, and all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. And when they saw him, they were astonished, and his mother said to him, Son, why have you treated us so? Behold, your father and I have been looking for you anxiously. And he said to them, How is it that you sought me? Did you not know that I must be in my father's house? That suggests a very different reception to Jesus' interaction with the leaders of the temple in his early life. So I began to think, what would have happened? Just imagine what would have happened if instead of the reaction that is portrayed in this particular piece that Matthew has shared. That was Luke, by the way. That passage doesn't appear in Luke. But in any case, what if instead of the way that the scribes and the Pharisees reacted, they would have said, Jesus, let's sit down and talk about this. See how we can work out your concerns and your observations and your conclusions and your recommendations and requests and demands with the way that we have set things up, and see if we can't reach some common understanding. That would have made all the difference. I think that God, that was one observation I wanted to make. The other is, I think that God doesn't give up on us. I think that God doesn't give up on the Pharisees and the scribes and the priests. I think that we set ourselves apart by imagining that we, of course, understand these things, and so we would have done the right thing from the very, very beginning. We would have said yes, and we would have done it. We wouldn't have had to rethink it. But in fact, we're always having to rethink it. We don't know what it was that caused the son to reconsider his initial rejection of the option. And in the same way, I don't think we're called upon to ask ourselves, how come the tax collectors and how come the prostitutes ended up making the decisions they made? We start where they are, which is a decision to go for Jesus. And the question then is, how then would the scribes and the Pharisees do that? I think that God always finds another way. And although we get to make choices, I think the Lord continues to provide us with options to make the right choice and nurtures us in that direction. So I think it would be worth thinking what would happen if someone dressed differently came to Palmacia Presbyterian Church one Sunday and addressed the crowd as it was exiting the church about their ways and about how they were spending their money. And I think my guess is that most people coming out of that church would think we're doing a pretty good job. But what if the foresayer there? Well, if you're doing a pretty good job, how come there's still people in places where you live and places where you serve who don't get enough to eat, who don't have enough money? And, what is your job there? And have a conversation about that instead of being confrontational. Say, let's sit down and talk about this. We don't do this. We say, here's the way it is, period, go on.
Thanks, Charles. And Bill Hull, just heads up, everybody. I'm going to do a quick closeout, but I'm going to turn it back to Bill for the final prayer. But for folks listening in, Palmacia Presbyterian Church is at 3501 West San Jose Street. That's in Tampa, Florida. And for more information, you can go to palmacia.org. That's PALMACEIA.org. And at that site, especially during a period of pandemic and isolation, there are other resources there. Discussions of the same gospel passages, contemporary worship, traditional worship services, sermons, meditations, updates, great music. So we commend that to you wherever you may be today, in your travels or in your homes, at your office, whatever you're doing. And then to wrap up, Bill, let me turn back to you for close.
Thank you. Thank you to my fellow team members. And again, thank you to those sharing with us later. Some time ago, Charles Willard, in a portion of our conversation not recorded, mentioned that there's an updated version of John Bailey's A Diary of Private Prayer, which was originally written in more kind of King James language, and Susanna Wright has revised it into more contemporary language. I got a copy of that, and my wife and I, Sybil, use it every day in our devotions. And in the providence of God, the other day after I started work on this passage, the prayer that I'm going to read in a moment was the prayer for that day. And for me, it was a powerful experience of, again, back to my statement a little bit ago, that I think for me, this parable is an invitation to look within, not focus out there, not try to be the gatekeeper, but look at myself. And for me, this prayer invited that, and I hope it will be of some help to others. So if I may, let us pray together. O everlasting God, let the light of your eternity fall now upon my passing days. O holy God, let the light of your perfect righteousness fall upon my sinful ways. O most compassionate God, let the light of your love fall on my life. Am I living as my conscience approves? Am I demanding of others a higher standard of behavior than I demand of myself? Am I less charitable about the failings of my neighbors than I am about my own? Am I standing in public for principles which I do not practice in private? Let my answer before you be truthful, O God. Do I ever allow physical satisfaction to take precedence over spiritual interests? Which is my priority when my course is not clear? Do I ever allow my own interests to take precedence over the interests of the community? Let my answer before you be truthful, O God. Am I in my daily life facing the stress of circumstances with strength and courage? Am I grateful for my many blessings? Am I allowing my happiness to be too dependent on money or career success or on the good opinion of others? Is the sympathy I show to others who are in trouble equal to the pity I would expend on myself if the same things happened to me? Let my answer before you be truthful, O God. Create in me a pure heart, O God, and put a new and right spirit within me. Through Jesus Christ, my Lord. Amen.